Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Nicole Quinn, and I'm here with Dr. Brenda Raud, co host of the Immunology Podcast. Welcome to the Lab Coats in Life podcast, where we help scientists thrive. The Lab Coats in Life podcast is brought to you by STEMCELL Technologies, a global biotechnology company supporting life sciences research as part of our efforts to foster communication and collaboration in science. If you enjoy the Lab Coats in Life podcast, rate us and leave a review. You can also suggest ideas or recommend guests for new episodes. Today, we have Dr. Nokuthula Mchunu from the National Research Foundation of South Africa on the podcast to talk about making science more accessible globally. Dr. Mchunu is the Deputy Director of the African Open Science Platform, which is hosted by the National Research Foundation in South Africa. With extensive expertise in academic outreach initiatives, science popularization, and the implementation of STEM activities within local communities, she previously served as senior researcher at the Agricultural Research Council of South Africa in the biotechnology platform. Dr. Mchunu earned her doctoral degree in fungal genomics and spent over 15 years as a senior scholar of the Department of Biotechnology at Durban University of Technology. But before we get to that, did you know that the Lab Coats in Life podcast is part of STEMCELL Technologies mentorship resources? Would you like to learn more about practical soft skills to help you communicate your science and read up on current trends and efforts in the scientific community? Visit www.stemcell.com/labcoatsinlife to find articles, free downloadable checklists, and more to help you thrive in science.
All right, so let's get started with our conversation with Nokuthula. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and talking to us. Maybe we could start the conversation with a little introduction. Already, Nicole gave a small introduction, but it would like to hear what is that you do at the Open African Open Science Platform. What has been your journey to this position so far? So let's just let listeners know a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. So my full name is Nokuthula Mchunu. Of course, I think to make it easy on everybody, you can call me Nox. It works very well also. So as you start a little bit and with Nicole giving the introduction, I think I started out as an academic, and as you can see with this podcast, most love science people. I always kid around, like to do some community type or side jobs that we always like to do. But my expertise, I started out in molecular biology and protein engineering a little bit, and then moved later into genomics, where I ended up at the Agricultural Research Council, where I worked on crops genomics. And I always tell people, and they make fun of me. I worked. My last job was working on cannabis genomics, which was quite interesting. But throughout that, when I go back a little bit, when I was at university for about 15 years, I really started my academic career at almost the peak of HIV and AIDS pandemic in South Africa, and being in a biotech microbiology, teaching some immunology type of based subject. So I wanted to actually take my students back into the community to how they would communicate, not the usual what we would call back in the days HIV/AIDS awareness, but more from the science side, and how they would work with their communities to do a lot of this awareness, but from the science-based type of thinking. And of course, along with that, with some of the projects I was doing, I worked a lot in agriculture with rural communities that work on what we call land research, which are seeds that are grown by communities. So this is what I continued to do when I was at the Agricultural Research Council, when we worked a little bit on indigenous legume genomics with cannabis, but really focused on using genomics for seeds that are rural based, not buying commercial seeds. And this is where I really, although I think when I was doing this for the 15, 20 years or so, it wasn't called citizen science in my mind. It was just called community engagement or something else, or engagement with community. But as you know now, as we go, it kind of been formalized within the international community called citizen science.
As a fellow genomicist, I relate to that. I always love to meet other genomics scientists. Okay, so at some point you moved into working on open science, and can you kind of outline that path and what you're working on now and um, what you've built?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. So I then moved to the National Research Foundation of South Africa, which is the largest public funder of research in the continent. And in South Africa, we fund all research or all university research and public institution about everything except clinical trials and professional degrees. So it's quite a big budget relatively in South Africa, not if we compare to the global north. So within that, so I sit in what we call partnership section, where we then the sections takes on also international projects. So with the invent of open science being formalized within UNESCO, and it was fortunate that in South Africa, our previous deputy director, our director general, I think in the Canadian sense, it would be deputy minister or assistant deputy minister to science and technology, was the chair of the UNESCO Open Science Working Group when it was started. So he had a vision when it was still going on in about 2015 to say Africa would need to kind of consolidate by themselves and how to approach this. So this is where it was proposed to start an African open science platform within Africa. And it was a unit that it was an initiative that was formed, but it was open to all the countries that they could host. And fortunately, then South Africa won the bidding to host it by the ministry. And of course, as a functioning agent of the ministry, we then hosted the African Open Science Platform. So within that, because it is quite a new formalized space, we kind of took on most of the roles of working on open science within South Africa and within the continent, and trying to make sure we coordinate the smaller activities that are happening within open science in the continent, and also try to embed open science within the partnerships that are happening with South Africa, with the continent, and globally, thereby promoting a kind of growing project at scale by opening data and sharing. But of course, in the global south, the biggest thing about open science, it is a way to address equity and reach equity in access and contribution to knowledge. There are many legs to it. I tell people there are many legs, like reproducibility of research. There is quality, and da. However, for the global south, before we get to reproducibility, before we ask what is the quality of research, we just still need to be able to access and freely contribute to the body of knowledge in science. And of course, when we use this word science and open science, we mean both core sciences and humanities.
This is a great kind of segue to the question I wanted to ask you. You know, Africa is, of course, a very large continent, has 1.3 billion people. That's, 17% of the world's population. So it's so diverse, it's so large. It has so many people doing so many different and having so many different backgrounds. From a scientist perspective, most genetically diverse continent on Earth. But and I think the answer that you're going to give me is probably are things to be learned for other contexts. But nowadays, in your position, trying to support African science, what are the main challenges? What are the main structural issues that you see and that to some extent you're trying to address? So for people that don't think too much about what are the challenges for African scientists, if you were to educate them, what would you say? What would the kind of information you would share with such people?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. And of course, I think when people think of Africa, they think of the pictures they see of poverty, lack of infrastructure. And that maybe the lack of infrastructure is true when we then need to first acknowledge the position of Africa as being once colonized continent, which means that they didn't have the rights of self-determination, of building their own infrastructure and resources. And even now, those inequities in resources and how resources are distributed within the continent and within the world still prevail, which impacts how science is conducted within the continent. However, I think fortunate enough, during COVID, it has shown that Africa can produce and is producing world-class science and science research. So for me, I think really is what you touched on a bit. Our strength in diversity also brings its own challenges. So in the continent, we generally divide the continent with you have the southern, eastern, south, central, west Africa, and north. And we know the North Africa is mostly uh, uh, has more in common with the Middle East and the Arab-speaking countries. So then, through many years of colonization, which I won't go back to, you have what we call is SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, which exclude all the Northern African countries, which we really didn't want to do. Then the other challenge is language, which then you have the Francophone, which is West Africa and Central Africa, which are predominantly French speaking. Never mind the indigenous language that thousands that prevail underneath that colonized language. And then, of course, you have the southern and eastern, which is us. We kind of Anglophone speaking. And then you have just the two countries which are Sinophone, the Portuguese, which is Angola and Mozambique, which they feel more left out because it's just the two of them, while the Francophone is 10 countries. So this diversity in language and lack of infrastructure and previous history of colonization has set back the continent quite a bit. This is why then when you look even at development at the continent, you find that Anglophone countries are more developed or more partake. If you look at the body of knowledge of contribution, they have more because English is a dominant language in science, which is another thing that we need to address. So I think for us then for open science and the African open science is to trying to figure out with this underlying infrastructure challenges, resource challenges, and of course language and diversity barriers, how do we come together as a continent, but also speak about this with global partners? So, and of course, we tried as an initiative to address this by having regional nodes that they would kind of figure out by themselves how they do, and then we support. But as I said, our biggest projects or sub-projects that we do are based on science contribution, engagement with science, and access to it. And this speaks to multilingualism. So in this discussion, is really big, and also leveraging infrastructure that exists within the continent that is not fully utilized, but making open for everybody in the continent to be able to use.
Yeah, excellent. There's so much in there that I'd love to dig into. Are there any lessons or like examples of progress that you've made, structural or systems, or I don't know, that have actually helped or that you think have hope in helping overcome the language challenge, and particularly that could expand to other areas in the world who face similar challenges?
Fortunately, with being at the NRF, probably, I don't know if you've heard of it, we have what we call the SK, the Square Kilometer Array Project, which is a global project of infrastructure that looks into space science, right? So generally, none of the African countries were engaging in the space science since about 2014, before this was established. So through this shared infrastructure, so 12 countries within the continent are when we negotiated with a global partner, South Africa asked that 12 of African countries can be partner with again, equitable models of contributing into this project. And by doing that, we then, if you understand how space science and data sharing and generating data, you will have access to the telescope or to the satellite dishes based on how much you could afford. But South Africa did not take that. It took based on the partners, and each partner can have a share of time spent in the telescope so that it is generated. And also there were programs that there were countries in the continent that can apply to freely access the SKA or the telescopes and the dishes without being partaking in any resource or form within the SKA. So this is one of the in high-end engineering has seen a lot of growth in science and space and even in skills. And then one of then in what we called open access for common languages, that we have what we call is NRENs. I think they exist in also in Europe and in Canada, is network of research and education within countries. So all universities belong to these networks, and then you have regional networks that are bigger. So these regional networks in the continent, previously they were configured to provide connectivity like EduRoam and network within the institution. So it could bring down the cost of connectivity, making it easier for institutions to do business. So over the years, they have built infrastructures that provide connectivity. So during these discussions with some of them, with government and with us, they've been slowly moving and talking to them and say, can you provide high computational power for universities to use repositories as however, that connects them to access and deposit work that that would be archived and shared with other universities within the continent. So one of these projects that we started testing out in the last year was the project that was built during COVID. So during the COVID in 2020, South Africa with other global partners like the IDRC in Canada, CEDA, UKAR, got together and put a pot of fund that in the continent could fund research, fund science communication, and citizen science. However, although it was a lot of money, a lot of great projects that were done by 17 countries, none of this was shared in any form except the normal way of publishing in journals. But we know that Science Com, you know that citizen science doesn't take form of a journal publication. So what we've then done since last year, we have provided a community space that we have bought DOIs for all the work that they've been doing. It could be videos, it could be pamphlets, it could be anything, it could be pictures that they produced, that it could be put up in one of the NREN cloud servers, that it could be provided and then freely available. But however, it could be associated as an output to whoever deposited that work, because it has a DOI attached to it, which we as an initiative and with the partners freely provide. So through that type of pilot, so the NRF has now committed that all the projects that we do within the continent will kind of start building these community spaces and databases that are connected, but have also identifiers for funders, for countries and researchers, that they can deposit work at any point in time, even if it has been published in a journal or has not been peer reviewed, but it can be freely available and archivable within these high computing facilities by the NREND. And the nice thing about the NRENs is that the universities are already members of this NREN, so it's an easier relationship to build than starting a different repository and another initiative on the side.
So basically, on the one hand, you have establishing equal partnerships with global collaborators, like really standing your ground and not and negotiating favorable conditions, for example, like you did with the radio telescope, and then providing the infrastructure to share the resources across the country, between countries, to generate more, to have make sure that at least science that is done in house is available for everyone in the continent. I think those are very very important, two very important concepts that you bring up. And from my perspective, also coming from Argentina, where we have similar issues, access to international literature is really difficult, is really expensive, is like beyond the means of many of the academic institutions in the country. And also, I think the access to um, equal partnerships is difficult, because usually the money is moves the influence is moved by the money, and then it's very difficult to say no to this an unfavorable offer, because the alternative is nothing sometimes. So I think that is really important to start bringing more equality in that sense, because everybody has something to offer, and in money is only one part of the equation, right? The expertise, the resources are also very important. And I think continents like, uh, the global south has a lot to offer in that sense, as long as we kind of really know what we're worth and work for it.
Yeah, I think you are right, because again, I think the world before during my time, but as a more younger researcher, we thought about equal partnership, which is a different concept to what is prevailing now, which is equitable partnership. We understand that the global south, South America, and cannot put dollar to dollar. That is just not going to work. However, we can put based on the economics and equitable resources to do this. And of course, and this has also been South Africa's uh, ethos, and we now starting to speak to our African countries that if you can get to a project, it doesn't have to be a lot of money, but you need to put something at the table so that you have also a sense of ownership and an openness to demand a certain way or partnership. Because if you have put nothing totally, it makes it also difficult to have this relationship. So in many of our projects or programs, we really work on this equitable partnership models in these days. And we are slowly starting to work with other African countries to come to the party. And this is also because, unfortunately, South Africa the government has taken a little bit of a shift, not only just growing South Africa. It looks that we can't grow the South African system without growing the African continent system, because you will just swim. So many of our programs, we have these negotiations that we want other African countries to be involved. So I'll give a little bit of these examples that we do. For example, I know you probably know that we are in the BRICS program of countries. I know some people are not happy, but you've seen that it's not about who really has money, but South Africa has advocated for joining of Egypt, Ethiopia, to make sure that this global partnerships are grown. We also have an initiative, again, funded through IDRC, CEDA, the NRF, UKR, and a few of global funders, that what we call is science granting councils. So what we do, NRF is a science granting council, like I think in Canada, SHEC is a few of the councils that give money for research to be done. In most of African countries, this do not exist. Either money comes through the ministries directly to the researchers, and this makes it very vulnerable to changes in government and politics. Yes, we are an agency. We also answer to politicians, but it buffers the system from the change in government. So this program of SGCI, the Science Granting Initiative, is to encourage countries in the continent to form formal science granting councils. So for any country in the continent is free to join. However, there are certain conditions that country undertakes, that it will form by act of parliament as science granting agency in a later years to come once they've graduated with that. So this is why, for example, in this podcast, we kind of now have to say National Research Foundation or NRF South Africa, because 2 years ago, NRF Kenya was formed, which is National Research Fund of Kenya. But if you look at it, so it comes through the science granting councils. You have FONRID, which is Burkina Faso, you've got FONSTI, which is Ivory Coast. So we are starting to see, and all of this, we are working together. It's actually helping to strengthen the science system in the continent. And once you do that, you strengthen the scientists, and they can contribute a little bit more, and then the issues become of access, in which wall they are facing. Is it the paying wall or the pay wall on the other side?
That sounds like really positive progress. And I want to go back to the equitable contributions thing, and the satellite or telescope example, because I was thinking, and this might be a very naive statement to make, but if countries can't necessarily contribute the funds, there are other things, like I'm sure access to clear skies and lots of open space in African countries is what people studying space really want. And so am I right here that there's other ways that and resources that can be offered that can help countries contribute to science, other than
Yeah. So yeah, I think you are actually correct at what you are hinting. So the SKA, which would be, once it's finished, would be the biggest telescope in the world. So it's a consortium of countries. Canada is in, the US, everybody, because even in South Africa is somewhere in the Northern Cape where nobody's live, is totally dark. It doesn't have light interference. So it is the right space to have the telescope. However, as I am not a astronomer, however, they tell me sometimes to build the bigger picture, you need other satellites. They might be smaller in other countries, but you can build the more complete pictures by having different pictures taken at different spaces, not just in one space. So it is then important to have other countries joining into the space science, because then you can build other telescopes that they might be much smaller, but they can participate. So the South African Meerkat, as it's called now, the functioning one, which has 64 dishes, and then you have one in Australia, the two functioning ones for now that are bigger. But I know there are plans to build other one or two dishes along the continent to make sure that they capture this. And this can only be done through these partnerships. Also, what we've seen in the science space is that in the astronomy space is that you need more astronomers. South Africa, we cannot all be astronomers. So the more you provide space, in the telescope, more you train astronomers across the continent and across the globe. We know in South Africa, before the SKA, we virtually had almost no astronomers. But once we had the SKA, we built that capacity to quite big. So even then, those astronomers who are using our telescope or may have come to South Africa as students actually train and then go back. I've been speaking to the managing director of the Sarau, which is in charge of the SKA, saying that most of the space programs in the African countries are started by people who were part of the SKA at some point in time. Otherwise, this means it would not happen if South Africa had not openly made it known that it would accept other South African countries to be part of this program.
Yeah, that's I mean, you articulated it so much better, but that's exactly what I was thinking. As soon as you get that interest, you start to build the infrastructure. Following infrastructure, you get the expertise, you get the training, and hopefully a trickle effect, just to get some momentum behind these things. And I'm hoping there are examples beyond. I'm also not an astronomer, obviously, but in every field of science, in immunology and other elements of biology, where you maybe tapping into genetic diversity or ecological diversity, where you can use these variable resources, or unique resources that can only be found in specific countries to start to build that momentum. But you did mention something that made me think a little bit about the issue of brain drain, because you said that people, will come and then they'll go elsewhere, and I'm sure that's something that that every country faces. I mean, Canada faces a brain drain, really. So I can only imagine what happens elsewhere. So, are there any comments you'd like to make on that, and anything that you've seen that helps avoid people leaving once they've, had the training.
Yeah, I think sometimes I will speak in general as a South African. In general, for us, it's relatively easy not really to want to leave. But I've known many people in different countries, different situations. They will make them leave their country to work somewhere else. However, I think Africa is in science. It's a growing continent, and I think you are getting more and more people kind of staying within the science space. You just talk of the moving away from what I don't know very well back to genomics. I mean, if you look at COVID, the amount of work that was done in South Africa on genomics and genomics platforms and sequencing platform was tremendous. And through that, South Africa has attracted even great minds outside of the continent, never mind in the continent. So yeah, I think strengthening the science system and infrastructure can kind of also stem the brain drain. So we make the example, as we've seen in South Africa during COVID, because of the amount of work and the genomics work and the sequencing work, we actually attracted a lot of people that want to work within the science space. And again, this system or the genomics platforms or the genomics research in South Africa was built mostly off the back of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, where we had it in the 90s and 2000, where then it kind of worked and moved towards genomics. And this capability and skills stayed in the country for quite some time. So when COVID came, it was easy for us to just redirect all that viral genomic work into COVID. And this again, we were able to do this because we maintained the skills, the infrastructures was there, the support on the system is there. So it's important for African countries to strengthen their systems, also to stem the brain drain out of the country. And also, I think it's kind of also now difficult with the heavily connected globe as a counter effect that everybody kind of moves everywhere and everyone wants to go everywhere. And on the positive side of the African continent, maybe it's a bad thing. We know that there's a lot of also pushback on immigration by global north countries, where it's now becoming more difficult to move. For example, I don't want to pick on Canada. The recent policy made on students and student movement in Canada is kind of going to completely switch the whole thing around. And then the continent obviously will benefit to this. However, we are seeing also a little bit of worrying trend to sway over to our partners in Latin America. I mean, we're looking at the policies in Argentina. I've spoken to a lot of people at universities. They're really worried about what is going on, and they've almost lost 50% of their funding, which means most of them will likely leave the system, and the system will kind of get crippled. So it's a lot of also other things outside of a lot of control of the researchers themselves that are happening.
Yes, that is a major issue. Volatility in places like Argentina, the volatility of different governments, they do and they undo, and because there's not a lot to start with, then it really makes a huge impact on what the resources end up being. And right now, it's there's a large movement of people outside of Argentina because the current government really, uh, yeah, has this a populist character that doesn't go well with supporting science and but I think that is in part when you have a system that is not strong, where you don't give enough strength to the institutions to really protect their own, then you are at the mercy of each different government that comes along. So it's important to build some resilience to the system, so people are, you can adapt to at least in the short term. Of course, in the long term, you need the support of the government, but try to soften the blows when you have the unfavorable, yeah, political uh, environment. That's very problematic. But I think that's very common in at least in Latin America. That you never know. Depends on the current government. I mean, that's everywhere, but sometimes when they're already so low, then you're very close to rock bottom. So then you reach rock bottom a lot faster. Um, and that's a problem because as a scientist, if you want to, you need to think of your lab. Your projects take years. A PhD student, you need to be able to guarantee at least 3 years, 4 years of salary. If you want to build something that lasts, something that matters, you need several years. You need a decade to build a research line that really makes a difference in the world. And if you don't know whether that money you have is gonna, you know, you really honestly, truly don't know what's gonna happen in 5 years, like for real. If Then it's really hard to build and to invest also your life, your time, your effort, and your career on something that it might be doomed from the start.
Yeah, so it is kind of that. So this is why I keep going back to how the NRF and South Africa is approaching, is trying to strengthen the kind of the region as much as it can as a whole, and kind of have some partial independence of science from government when you have these uh, science agencies that are really bit outside of government. Because I mean, in South Africa, you've seen it with a change of government so many times, but we've kind of, as the NRF, kind of stabilized the university, because the universities really don't feel that much of a change of government. We may feel it, but because they kind of get our money from us, not from government as they would think, it makes it different. But it makes it even more important, which is something I probably, as you said, I talk about in many of my talks and discussion, is how the global science community works together to kind of make sure that the science we do is it is the science for society. That is one thing. And that science that we do, it is really freely available, as freely as it can be, and everybody has access and can contribute to it. So it makes it really frustrating. I mean, we all been groomed in this way of communicating our sciences, we call it, in a general way, but we need to now start to ask our question, is that, is the journal the way to communicate science? Is it really a way to attack, or to attempt to make a dent in the global challenges? So if you look at the work or the analysis that was done in the University of Ottawa by Stephanie Hussein, that looked at the last 5 years of how much the top 5 publishers have made from what they call open access, or which is to pay to publish, is over $10 billion in 5 years' time. They've completely switched the model from pay to subscribe to pay to publish, which means in general it costs you 2,000 and a half K in dollars to publish. Can somebody from South America afford this? Can somebody from a continent afford?
It's even a problem for North American scientists. It's I I can't stress this enough, that the the publishing model as it has been built is not the public. It is just not the scientific communications model that needs to go forward. And we've had a lot of excellent conversations within the Lab Coats and Life podcast with about this open access topic or open science topic. We spoke with Richard Sever, who was a co-founder of BioArchive, and we recently spoke with a co-founder of PubPeer, which is another way of accessing. It's focused on published science, but accessing, uh, creating open dialogue globally around science, and we've also talked about open data quite a bit. And I think more of these conversations are necessary because I fully agree that global accessibility to scientific information is fundamental, not only for the sake of the individuals contributing and the ability for people around the world to contribute, but also for the sake of science, because the publishing model is slow and it's selective and it's limited, and it slows everything down, and we need to move faster if anything. So I fully agree with you. um what I wanted to ask you next is, what advice, I mean, you've dedicated so much. You spoke to this at the beginning, that your core job is actually a researcher, but you've done this you've dedicated so much of your time and your life and your expertise to facilitating open science and to try to increase access to science, specifically in Africa, but working globally, of course, as well. And I thank you for that. I think that's amazing. And I'm wondering what advice you would give to other scientists who want to do similar things, who want to also contribute to making science more accessible globally, regardless of where they're working from.
Yeah, it is. I think I will start from two different angles. I mean, in December, we had what we call the Diamond Summit, which talk about how we can contribute to science freely, journals without paying, or institution paying, either or, which is great. However, the second problem is what we call research assessment. It's not because the researchers, I would love them to do what I did, which is contribute a lot of your time to doing community engagement, working with communities at whatever space and time. But slowly, as we have moved now in the past 10 years, even so, universities have become, or research institutions have become a little bit different on how they do business. So as a researcher, you are required to do A, B, and C. You won't get paid for A, B, and C. And then slowly, increasingly, all these other things of community engagement and making sure that science is accessible and is shared with society becomes very hard. So I think then researchers or scientists, if you ask them, they are overburdened. They cannot do anymore. They are asked to publish 5 to 10 papers a year, which is simply impossible. So I think we need to incentivize researchers for doing community or communicating their science in a different way to communities. If governments and institutions do not change this, then you will only have a few scientists or researchers who just like to do, and on top of whatever they need to do, they will keep doing that. And then you'll just have a few researchers, you'll have most of them not doing anything. So what this will contribute to, or what will be the result, is this. UNESCO, I think in a year or 18 months ago, published a study where we looked at how the communication of science with COVID looked like. Where is it and who's using it? 70% of it is openly available to anyone. Then if we move a little bit on the climate change side, 80% of it is still somewhere. Nobody knows what is going on in that, because then it means people who are doing climate change are still just producing papers, and that's the only thing that they are doing. And then we will not solve any challenges. So the issue of incentivizing researchers, and really then researchers, I want to say this very diplomatically, is that when we all got into research, when you were first year PhD student, you wanted to solve this biggest world problem and you were driven to do that. If anybody asks you in that first day, was not that in 10 years' time I'll be a professor and I would have published 100 papers. You were just wanting to solve the social problem. And I think we need to move back to that as scientists, is that do we do science for fame so that we can say you publish in Nature, or do you really are solving world problems? Then if you are doing that, you will engage with the community that has a problem, because if you find a solution, you should engage with that community. And I always try to go back to that as researchers, to think why we are doing what we are doing, not the fame that comes with publishing an impact of 50, which is a made up number to begin with.
Yeah. Oh, so much. I agree across the board with what you said. And I don't think that's limited. I think that's a global problem. No matter where you are, researchers are overburdened with the pressures that they have just to keep up with research and keep funding in
Yeah.
their labs. And those side things like science communication, like mentorship, like contributing to their communities and contributing to the global scientific community, is those are not necessarily incentivized and rewarded. And what it comes down to is, yes, we do have to get back to those fundamental desires. Like people don't go into science to necessarily, get rich. Although there is money there, more and more as things are moving more and more to be commercialized. But generally, scientists go into science for all the right reasons. But ultimately, humans need to look after themselves and their families, and
Yeah.
so you end up having to make decisions that might not align with the reasons you started in science. And we need to remove that so that we can contribute in better ways. Absolutely. Brenda, any thoughts?
No, I agree. I think you hit the nail on the head several times. It is absolutely important to have the opportunity, have the resources to do the right thing by science, and not to feel um yeah overwhelmed, so overwhelmed with like the bare minimum that then you forget which are the things that really bring value to society. I think that's very important. And I feel that, I feel that every day. It's really tough. You really want to do something for the community, but then that's not, oftentimes, that's not something that you can put in your grant application to keep getting a salary. You're going to run out of salary next year and you need to fix that. And usually, I think there are some winds of change. I think in sometimes you can. I think more and more there are some initiatives to keep other extracurricular activities on in view. But in the end, this is kind of how it goes at the moment, and this has a also a extra burden on places where publishing is really hard because it's really costly, or making the data is really costly, not because you're not capable or you don't have the good ideas. It's just that because the resources are limited and therefore everything takes you longer, or there's some experience you just cannot do because you don't have the resources, and then perpetually on this disadvantageous position, and it's really hard to get out.
Yeah, or you have to publish in English, and English isn't your first language, and then you have to
Yeah.
engage with
Yeah.
translators or editors,
Yes.
or just to get your publication into that broken system that existed in the first place. But
Oh, don't get me started. You didn't want
yeah,
to talk about the
we're
publishing
we're
system.
going down a rabbit
Oh.
hole of negativity, and that's not the intent here. So let's bring it back. I think we're almost out of time here, but I'd love to ask Dr. Mchunu, if there's anything we didn't ask you or anything else you'd like to add to the conversation. You're so full of knowledge and insight and experience, and I'd love, anything we didn't hit on with the questions that you really want to share with the world.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I think we've covered most of the things. You can get. I can talk the whole day, as the team will tell you. But I think what Brenda was just saying is that I think we need to move out. We need to get to a situation where we don't look at the open science. Open science is not a side thing. It is a right way to do science, as people would say it. it shouldn't be an extra curriculum activity like a side job. It should be the main way on how we do that, and then we incentivize this. And then just to get back to what you said, Nicole, is that the publishing model or pathway that we have is long. It is arduous. It is full of many inequities, right? So, however, I make this one call before we end this podcast, is that as scientists, the publishing system is built on us. I mean, from beginning to the end, we contribute, we do the final review for the publishers to take everything. We really need to think about how to rethink that whole thing structurally, because if all scientists and researchers pull away from the current publishing model, it will force publishers to rethink. They could offer services to researchers, not the other way around. And then in that thought, we also then need to ask ourselves, with the digital platforms and technology we have, is again the journal the only way to publish or to pass our thoughts and ideas? Because yes, I think, this is my opinion, the work we do as scientists, maybe 5% needs to be communicated to our peers in that language nobody understands. Even I, in genomics, sometimes try to figure out what the person is saying. But 95% of it is regurgitating one or two things, but finding application in a different setting. That needs to be 2, 3, 1-pager to the stakeholders that you're doing that to, not to the community. So I think we need to figure out, and then once you take away all that pressure, we will really have a different way of how science is communicated or should be communicated in the world.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your work and for your time for this podcast and for all of your insights. And it was an absolute pleasure to meet you. I would, love to meet you in person sometime. I know we're all very globally, global, but please stay in touch. And all the very best. Thank you for that conversation.
No, thanks you, Nicole and Brenda. It's been a pleasure. I'll hope if I'm at your side of the world, it seems we are frequenting there. We'll get in touch. I will tell you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. Such an interesting conversation. And I just love talking with people passionate about, changing the world for better and making sure everybody has a space on it, a place on for themselves. So that's so important. I really, really, it really resonates with me. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you for having such a good conversation.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our show. Don't forget to sign up for our email list at www.labcoatsandlifepodcast.com to get show notes, episode summaries, and links to useful information. Or learn more about STEM mentorship via the resources found at www.stemcell.com/labcoatsandlife. You can also reach out to us on X via STEMCELL at STEMCELL Tech or via email at info@labcoatsandlifepodcast.com with feedback or to suggest guests.